Well, welcome everyone. Let us know if you've got any technical needs in the chat box at any point within this program. But we are here tonight to explore historical hauntings with Shaun Boyd, who is our Curator of Archives. And Shaun and I often work in the second floor storage. And there's a lot of energy going on there, wouldn't you say, Shaun?
It can be a little, yeah. I mean, my version of that energy is like Belle in Beauty and the Beast. Like, I'm super excited to be there, but yes.
Let me just put it this way. If I'm the last one in there and I'm the one who has to turn off the lights, and I say, is anybody in there? Because, you're thinking, oh, Curator Shaun, maybe, who knows?
Sure.
Sometimes I wait, and we're going to hear some stuff about what happens when we ask, or we're recording and we're talking, and there's some voices and feedback.
Yes, and one of the sites I'm going to talk about is a museum, and we thought it was maybe tied to the artifacts. So, yeah.
Yep, exactly. So get ready, everybody, for historical hauntings with Shaun Boyd.
Let's see if we can get this to work. Oh.
Yep. Hold on, I got to do one little technical detail. There you go.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Let's see if this works. Okay. Can everybody see the screen? I can't see other people now. So, okay. Tamar's giving me the thumbs up. Yeah. Hello. I am Shaun Boyd. I'm the Curator of Archives. This is a talk that I first developed when I was at the Douglas County Libraries for several years. But I've added some new content if you've seen it before. And I found this great meme that's going around right now. Virtual meetings are basically modern seances. So, we're kind of in a modern seance. And I felt like it was important to do that land acknowledgement, because you don't want to be talking about like ghost stories without acknowledging all the people that were around us, who could be around us in a cloud of witnesses, as my church sometimes says. So let me get my slides moving. Okay, so these are the stories that I'm going to tell. And if you are a younger person who gets scared, I will warn you once we get past the botanic gardens, because that's when I'm going to get into the paranormal investigations that either I have learned about or have been a part of. So it'll take a turn right after the Cheesman Park Botanic Gardens section. Okay, so my first story is the oldest of my stories and the most rooted in history. It also takes a little bit of time, so it's a little slower than the subsequent stories, but stick with me. Out on the Old Cherokee Trail, which was the route between Bent's Fort up in down in southern Colorado, so it's down here, Bent's Fort, and Fort Bridger up in Wyoming. This was the route that was kind of the connector between the Oregon Trail and the Santa Fe Trail. It was called the Cherokee Trail. And a lot of pioneer folks that were coming out for the gold rush took this route in the between 1859 and 1865. And there were ghost stories about the site that's pictured there, which was at Point of Rocks. And those are not the rocks that Point of Rocks is. That's actually a site called Fagan's Grave. And it was one of the landmarks where you could stay overnight, but it's at Point of Rocks, which is right here on the map. Okay, and buried under them was a man named Michael Fagan. Okay, Fagan had been part of the Marcy Loring expedition of 1857-1858. And they were sent out by the US government to fight in the Mormon War after the Mountain Meadows Massacre of September 1857. And that was actually in southern Utah, but it takes the government a while to send people out. They arrived at Fort Bridger in Wyoming at the start of winter, and then they marched down to Fort Massachusetts near the San Luis Valley for the whole winter of 1857. That's where they stayed. The next spring, they were supposed to head to Utah and go back up to Fort Bridger and then come down. Marcy's larger force was told to wait on Fountain Creek, which is just east of Colorado Springs, and that more supplies and men were on their way. Loring's small group started out from near Taos at the end of April 1858. So this is all happening in the spring of 1858. With them was Michael Fagan, a citizen teamster. Oh wait, not that kind of teamster. This kind of teamster, who was hired in New Mexico to guide the soldiers and supplies up to Wyoming. The two groups were within 7 miles of each other on April 29th, 1858. Marcy was on Black Squirrel Creek and Loring was 7 miles north at Point of Rocks. Captain Marcy said he would remember the spring day in April 29th, 1858. And any of us who have been in Colorado in April know that the weather can shift kind of quickly. So this is what it looked like at the beginning of the day. The day was bright, cheerful, and pleasant. The atmosphere soft, balmy, and delightful. The fresh grass was about 6 inches high. The trees had just put forth their new leaves, and all nature conspired in giving evidence that the somber garb of winter had been cast aside for the more verdant, smiling attire of spring. Our large herds of animals were turned out to graze upon the tender and nutritious grass that everywhere abounded. So, you know, things are going well. And the guys were enjoying jokes and pastimes and, you know, hanging around. And everything, back to the quote, everything indicated contentment and happiness. This pleasant state of things lasted until near sunset, when the wind suddenly changed into the north. It turned cold and soon commenced snowing violently and continued to increase until it became a frightful winter tempest, filling the atmosphere with a dense cloud of driving snow, against which it was utterly impossible to ride or walk. Late that same afternoon, Second Lieutenant Dubois had ridden ahead to Colonel Loring's camp at Point of Rocks to visit some of his friends from Fort Union. At sunset, he attempted to return back to Captain Marcy's camp on Black Squirrel Creek, but by then he could no longer find his way in the wind-driven snow. So he described what the evening and nighttime looked like. Returning, I sat down by McNally's fire, but this soon became worse than nothing. We went to bed early. Morning came and still the storm raged with redoubled fury. Our beds were covered with snow to the depth of 2 feet. It was almost impossible to stand before the fury of the wind. A fire could not be lighted, and cold raw bacon was all we could find to eat. Half the tents were down and the men under them covered in drifts of snow. Not a soldier was visible. All our stock had stampeded. Nothing was left in camp but McRae's horses. It snowed all day. It snowed. At night, I slept in McRae's tent. We couldn't sleep. It was so cold. We drank 4 quarts of liquor during the day when we were in the snow without feeling any effect. During the night, we heard the cries, and opening our tent, 2 Mexicans stumbled in, almost dead. Their limbs and faces were completely frozen. One had carried the other a half a mile, and being lost in the drifting snow, our light had saved their lives. We rubbed their limbs and gave them blankets, and in 2 hours they were almost comfortable. In the morning, a dead man was found within 100 yards of our tent, frozen to death. And that man was Michael Fagan. And once the snow cleared, he said the men were turned out of their nests from under the snow, and some attempts were made to cook. This morning it had ceased snowing. We buried the man who had frozen to death. And after the storm passed, a burial detail scraped away the snow along the west side of Kiowa Creek and dug a shallow grave to hold the remains of the frozen teamster. They kept the wolves away by placing several rocks on the grave, with a large rock at either end. They also erected a wooden cross with the probable inscription, Michael Fagan, May 2nd, 1858. And the only eulogy given was a simple statement in the record of Colonel Loring to the Secretary of War: a citizen teamster in our quartermaster's employ was frozen to death. So that's the historical account of what happened to Michael Fagan. Then things started taking kind of a weird turn. People started seeing the ghost of Michael Fagan as far south as Oklahoma and as far north as Wyoming. There were those who claimed that the teamster had been buried alive, that his ghost could still be seen riding in the wind on the backs of buffalo or wild horses. Others spoke in hushed voices of a strange figure dressed in a full army uniform and with a musket in hand, who would materialize in the dark to stand sentinel over the lonely grave. And even those who didn't believe in ghosts continued to spread the rumor of a cache of whiskey hidden somewhere nearby. and so there was a story of like he was riding through a lady's washing. You know, you would hang your clothes on a washing line, and Fagan was accused of riding through the prairies. So then this colorful character of Colorado history, whose name was Dick Wooten, enters the picture, and he was a tall tale teller of early Colorado, if ever there was one. He ran later on, after this part of the story, he ran the toll road at over Raton Pass. So if you wanted to go to Santa Fe, you had to pay him to get over the toll road, which is part of now I-25. So if you take I-25 all the way south to Santa Fe, you would go past his area. And he was a Confederate sympathizer during the Civil War. And there was, that was not a popular thing to be in Denver. And he was a very talkative guy. And so it got around that he was a Confederate sympathizer. So he kind of left in the middle of the night, and he was heading down to Southern Colorado where there were more Confederate sympathizers. And so he was kind of sneaking his way down the Front Range, and he ended up camping at Fagan's grave. And he said he was awakened by the sound of horses' hooves. He hurried to the ravine where he had hidden his horse and made ready to gallop off should the visitors prove to be the posse from Denver City. Suddenly, out of the darkness came a voice. "Look sharp now for ghosts. This is Fagan's camp, and they say the dead soldier's ghost stands guard over the grave every night." As if on cue, the smoldering campfire burst into flames. The startled visitors would have bolted to safety at once had not a calmer voice suggested they make an investigation. Not a word above a whisper was spoken as they approached the fire. Finally, someone blurted out, "It's Dick Wooten's campfire, and I'm a natural-born liar if he ain't been asleep on Fagan's grave." And then Dick Wooten emerged from the shadows. He found that they were friends of his, all of whom had also left Denver because they were Confederates. And then they passed around the whiskey. And he said, "We didn't look for another camping place, but raked together the remains of my fire and piled on more fuel. Nobody cared much about sleeping, but we sat around the fire and talked over war matters and nursed our grievances until morning. Then we went on to Pueblo and never heard anything more about proposed arrests. When it got noised around that I not only stayed all night at Fagan's camp, but actually kindled a fire on the grave and slept alongside it until I was awakened by the party looking for me, it spoiled a pretty good ghost story, and Fagan's camp was no longer avoided by the mountain men or other travelers who had reason to go that way." So, you know, is Dick Wooten the original Colorado Ghostbuster? That's kind of the punchline of that story. Okay, so the next site is in Castle Rock. In fact, the next two sites are in Castle Rock. This is actually St. Francis of Assisi Catholic Church in Castle Rock. For many years, it was a popular restaurant called the Old Stone Church. In about 2008, it changed ownership and stopped being called that. It's another Italian restaurant now, but it is still a restaurant. And it was built in 1888, and it's made of rhyolite, which was the main building stone and the main industry in Castle Rock. Was the main industry in 1888, was cutting the stones that's made of. If you do any kind of ghost research on Castle Rock, there has been kind of in the last 5 to 10 years, there have been people saying that the rhyolite is kind of psychically absorbative. I don't quite know why, except that we've been telling these stories about buildings that are made of rhyolite, and maybe the stories are seeping into the consciousness of the community. Anyway, it was built by local church members at a cost of $1,000. And founding members of the church included local lawyer William Dillon and a number of German Catholic families who lived southeast of Castle Rock. This is the Amon family, and this is the Depke family, and they were founding members of the church. And there was a notable incident in the 1920s when the Klan had taken over Colorado. In that a cross was burned on the lawn in front of it. It's right across the street from the local courthouse. And it didn't have enough people to justify a full-time priest, so they kind of went on circuits. So they didn't get a full-time priest until 1930. And the guy before that had 6 churches that he had to go on. And he actually built the vestibule in front here. In 1930, they built that. So of course, you know, I'm talking about it on a ghost talk. So the staff at the restaurant, and I went in there after it changed ownership, and they were still telling stories about things happening. The most notable to me was in the upper level, and I hope you guys can see my cursor. So the upper level behind this rose window in the front, there used to be a balcony where you could sit. And it's been remodeled since then, but there are still like tables and storage up there. And there was a little girl having dinner in the restaurant who said that she saw another little girl with an axe in her head up there. No idea why there would be a little girl with an axe in her head in this building. No violent deaths that we know of. Also, the staff have seen kind of a woman in white in this front vestibule lighting candles. I spoke to the manager in probably 2017, and he had recently installed an app on his phone that was like a burglar alarm type app that if there was movement, it would alert him, and he had to turn it off because it was going off so frequently at night. He started getting freaked out. I mean, there are stories of salt and pepper shakers moving and pots and pans falling, and they're usually willing to tell more stories about that building, but it's definitely a hotbed. If you look this up online and see rumors about it, there were never any burials anywhere near here. This is not that kind of church. William Dillon, the guy who was one of the founders, has a very prominent gravestone in the Cedar Hill Cemetery in Castle Rock. And if anybody would have been buried there, it would have been him. So yeah, there were never any graves there, but people are still hanging out there apparently. Okay, next site, also in Castle Rock, also made of rhyolite, also built in the late 1800s, is the Canter School. This was it's only a one-room school. It's probably about 10 rooms, but it was the main K through 12 school in Castle Rock. The original Castle Rock High School, actually this is the original Castle Rock High School. The school that was on this site previously didn't go all the way to high school. It only went through 8th grade, but this was the ad for the high school, including primary and intermediate departments, attention paid to finishing the 8th grade. So in the building, they have a gym and an auditorium, classrooms, and a bell tower, and then there's a grand staircase. It's now owned by the school district, and they use it for administrative offices and teacher training. So this is the building, the one on the lower left is the building that it replaced, which burned down in 1897 due to a defective flue. And there is a story about that building that I'm going to get into here in a second. Actually, it's this story. So there is a gulch just north of Douglas County High School, which is also in Castle Rock, called Hangman's Gulch. And at the time of the sort of early pioneer period, so we're talking before 1874 when the town of Castle Rock was founded, but after 1860, there were apparently a couple of horse thieves in southern Colorado, and one of them, well, they were caught down near Larkspur, which is between Castle Rock and the county line at Palmer Lake and Monument. And they got caught. One of them, they hung him there and left him hanging, which caused stories down in the Larkspur area. And the other one, they were going to march him up to Denver, but he got lippy somewhere near Castle Rock. So they decided to hang him in a gulch north of Castle Rock and bury him in the side of the creek. And about 5 to 10 years later, you know how creeks here can like be nothing, and then they can turn into like raging rivers when it actually rains. The bones were washed up out of the creek bed, and the enterprising citizens of Castle Rock reassembled them and used them in this school, in this older school, to teach anatomy. This was the legend in the town of Castle Rock. And when that building burned down, someone claimed that they saw somebody run in to save the skeleton and bring it back out. Now, I have talked to people that have worked in the newer building that was built in 1898. And they have not seen a skeleton, but you know, if you're talking to the Douglas County schools, you should ask them if they have skeletons in their closet, because they might be there. So other sightings in this building include a woman in blue. This is just a representation. This is not actually her. But she's been seen walking down the grand staircase. Lots and lots of creaks and bumps and noises. And this is a very famous ghost photo on the tulip staircase. It's actually at a lighthouse, but it's kind of representing somebody walking up and down the stairs. The other story that I heard firsthand from somebody who worked there, they were in this sort of upper area here is a big classroom slash, now it's a media center where they store books and things. And they were in there looking for a particular book. And the book fell off the shelf and fell open to the page that they were looking for when they asked out loud for it. And most of the people who work in this building don't like working there after hours because of all the noises that happen. Okay, so the Spring Valley Cemetery is on, it's a lovely drive out south of, you could take Parker Road out of Denver, and then go down near Castlewood Canyon, and then sort of jog over and go, there's a dirt road that you have to go down. But this cemetery was established in 1870, and it's basically for the local rural community that lives there. It was established officially as a cemetery in 1877, but the oldest graves from 1870. They built a little chapel there in the 1960s. And there was a woman who worked there for many years named Iola Geiger, who she and her husband were the caretakers of the cemetery. They did all the burials. I mean, this is like an era, the 50s and 60s, when you're still well, maybe not by the 60s, but by the 50s, you're still hand digging graves. So she told me the story that she was out there one afternoon, and it was like a bright, sunny Sunday afternoon, and she's out there with her husband digging a grave, like you do. And she said she saw these people coming toward her, and it looked like three boys. Well, it looked like three people, right? And then so she got up out of the grave she was digging, and I'm picturing like a woman in a 1950s dress, like digging, and then she like brushed herself off and got ready to greet these people. And they were coming toward her, but they were not acknowledging, like, you know, she's like waving and trying to get their attention, and they just kept moving in a straight line. And they got within probably 100 yards of her, and she realized it was three boys, and they were all dressed in like identical outfits, but they looked like Civil War kind of outfits, and they were just walking and not paying any attention to what she was doing. And then they walked through the fence on the back of the property and disappeared out into the prairie, which this is a pretty open, the trees there notwithstanding, it's pretty open space. So that was just like a real life ghost story that Iola told me probably in the late 1990s, early 2000s. So if you are in Denver, of course, the monster, it's not really a ghost story, it's just a creepy Halloween story, could be ghosts involved, is Cheesman Park. And for this talk, I actually did kind of a deep dive, no pun intended, into Cheesman Park to try and get more details, because for years I've been doing this talk, and I used to say, well, you know, it was the original cemetery for Denver. This map shows where the locations were. And it was established in 1858, right around the same time Denver was. And they started burying people there pretty quickly afterward. A lot of the people that were buried there were sort of out here by themselves, especially in that early era. But they did have they had a military section, which was called the GAR on this map, which means Grand Army of the Republic. That's the Union veterans. Graves were on the north end. And then there was the Masonic section, and the Botanic Garden, what is now the Denver Botanic Gardens, was the Catholic cemetery. And then where the parking lot is of the Botanic Gardens across the street was the Jewish cemetery. And by about 1890, they're already referring to this as a ruin and already referring to it as like abandoned by 1890. And that's where the picture that we've used as our sort of cover letter for this comes from. So the first sign that it was declining for somebody like us who's trying to look at newspapers and look back on it was in 1889. The Grand Army of the Republic had relocated Memorial Day services to Riverside Cemetery. And then there was a lot of debate within the city because there were also these pressures of like, let me go back to the map, like this is a very posh neighborhood now it's a posh neighborhood, and they wanted it to be a posh neighborhood in the 1890s. There were these developers who were trying to like build more houses as Denver was growing out to the east. And so there was this pressure to like, let's just move the cemetery and get everything kind of relocated. And so they contracted out to the lowest bidder to remove all the graves. So first they like made an announcement and said, okay, if you have family, you should relocate them to Cheesman or to Riverside or Fairmont cemeteries. But a lot of people didn't really take them up on that offer. And so then in 1893, they started contracting, and the prices are a little underestimated. So let's see, they spec'd out the graves at $5 per grave, which if you have had to pay for a cemetery plot anytime in the last 20 years, $5 a grave in 1893 is about $144. So $144 per grave for the location, and then $1.90, or today's value of $54.87 to do the work of moving the graves, so digging them up and moving them. So the contractor would have been paid something around $200 current prices per grave. Within the first month, which was March of 1893, there were complaints because the public was like watching this process, and they were accused, the contractors were accused of like splitting one body across 3 coffins because they could get paid more. And then they would do like a whole box of leg bones and a whole box of heads and yeah, so it was turning into a bit of a scandal. And then they were also like stealing jewelry and other stuff off of these graves. So within a month, this process got shut down, and they literally just covered it up. Like I imagine they put up a fence, but that was about it. And then I went back and looked through the newspapers because I thought, all right, there was this scandal. Then about 6 months later, they made the announcement, okay, the city's not going to move these things. You have to get in here and move them to the public. And like the GAR got all their people out, like the veterans got all their people out. The Catholic folks mostly got moved. The Jewish folks mostly got moved because they had a community that could like raise money and do this. But that still left quite a few. And I looked through the newspapers trying to find, okay, well, when did they resolve this? They never resolved it. So they had this debate about, there was a lawsuit in 1894 about whether you could still bury somebody in a park once it had been declared a park. And the city lost the lawsuit because they made it too specifically about Cheesman Park. So I know there were still people being buried there because this grave, or I mean, this picture right here is the moving of Horace Tabor's grave in the 1930s. These two pictures, these are from the History Colorado collection. He died in 1899, which means they were still burying people there in 1899. So up to 1900. And then as they were building the pavilion there at Cheesman Park, they found, I think, was it 6 bodies the first exhumed a pine box containing the body of a cowboy attired in full costume. The body was identified during the day by General Cook as L.P. Griswold, a desperate character who was killed in 1870 while attempting to escape from jail. Griswold was in jail awaiting trial for the murder of James O'Neill at Browns Bridge near Littleton. He was a noted desperado and was buried in Murderer's Row. And here's the other folks that were buried with him. Today, the men are engaged in exhuming the remaining bodies, but up to this late hour had failed to locate them. So like the first day of trying to build that pavilion, they found a body that they could identify who it was. And then I found, this article, the hearing of cases in which the health department complains that the Catholic and Jewish cemeteries in Congress Park has been postponed to the police court until September 11th. That was also from 1908. Oh no, sorry, that one's in 1895. So that one's pretty quickly after the scandal. But this small boys found building fort of tombstones in the cemetery was from 1927. As late as the 1940s and 50s, there were little references to Cheesman Park saying that there were still headstones like behind the pavilion and that they knew they needed to do something about them, but they hadn't. In 1978, a lady named Louisa Ward Arps gave a very similar talk as to what I'm doing about the history of Cheesman Park and bemoaned the fact that they hadn't moved the graves. So that's kind of like, I just thought that story was resolved, but it really isn't. And there are ghost stories of that neighborhood around Cheesman Park, of like, especially around 1893, that early period, people would see, like there was a story of a woman seeing a ghost in a mirror in her brand new house in the Cheesman Park neighborhood. There's a church, a couple churches near there. And one night, one of the ministers was locking up and he went out, and this was like in the 1950s, I think. He went out and he saw a man standing outside the church wearing kind of like a Victorian outfit. And he talked to the guy. He had a whole conversation with him. And he realized it was the person that the church was named after who had been buried in that cemetery. And the guy interacted with him, walked away, like you just have a quick conversation with somebody. And then later on, the minister saw a picture of the founder of that church and was like, that's the same guy. And of course, the Botanic Gardens has lots of stories. There's a book that came out last year, I believe, called What Lies Beneath, that's about ghost hunting at the Botanic Gardens. There's a really nice story that I found online about a woman who was walking through the Botanic Gardens and found a rosebud, like, on the path, picked it up, carried it around for a little bit. And then she saw a tombstone because they were digging for a new section of the Botanic Gardens. And there was like a pile of debris and there was this little tombstone there. And so she set the flower on the tombstone. This would have been in the 1980s. And then she went home and thought about the fact that the Botanic Gardens was a cemetery. And the next morning she woke up and went in, took a shower, came back out, and there was a rosebud on her bedside table. So it's like it followed her home. She thought it was a little girl or someone who had followed her home. One of my friends is the librarian at the Botanic Gardens, and one of her volunteers told her that they had the volunteer, when the Botanic Gardens started, said that they had one bucket for weeds and one bucket for bones when they were digging the new areas at the gardens. They did find 2 more rows of graves, not just 2 graves, 2 rows of graves in, I want to say 2008, when they were expanding the parking garage, which would have been in that Jewish section of the cemetery. Okay, so I'm going to shift into actual paranormal. Yes.
Before you move on, we have a quick question. Where is the hangman's tree? Hangman's tree in Cheesman Park.
I don't have any idea. I would guess. I don't know. I mean, I didn't get that deep into the research into Cheesman Park. I know that they re-landscaped the whole thing in the 1930s. So I would have to, you'd have to ask somebody who like works
Right.
there,
Right.
or maybe somebody in the comments may know.
Yeah.
But yeah, sorry, that one I don't know.
Outside, we have a reply. Outside the back gate of the Botanic is the Hangman's Tree.
Okay.
I just find this very interesting, you know, all this place-based kind of landmark stuff, like what gets literally dug up, what gets rearranged, re-landscaped, but still that kind of psychic.
Right, and what gets remembered.
Yep.
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, for me, the Cheesman Park story is just even weirder this year because I really thought they'd moved most of it, but they hadn't. There's an estimate that there's still 3,000 graves there. So, have any other questions come up so far, Tamar?
That was the one. There's also a question about, will you show us that map again? And I believe that was for the Cheesman Park.
I can do that.
So.
Yeah, just to see where the parts are. And, you know, if you go on a modern aerial on Google Earth, you can see these lots are still very clear. So hopefully this is, oh, James is raising his hand. It's like we're at the halfway point with the talk. Okay, go ahead. I don't know how you want to handle that, Tamar.
Usually, James, if you want to type your question in the chat box, that usually works better. Yeah, just so Shaun can kind of stay in her flow, be happy. And you can also message me personally, but
yeah, we'll come back and have time for questions and combo at the end too. So I wanna jump ahead to my two investigations. So the first was at the Highlands Ranch Mansion. And if you are not familiar, the neighborhood of Highlands Ranch is an unincorporated area just south of Littleton, it's on the northern edge of Douglas County. It's got about 175,000 people that live there, but it's unincorporated. So it used to be one big ranch. And this house was the headquarters when it was a ranch. Like one family owned this entire area, basically between I-25 and Santa Fe and the County Line Road and what is now Wildcat Reserve Parkway. So it's a big property. And the house has it originally had 14 bedrooms. They've knocked a couple of walls out to make it like meeting rooms and stuff. But the house was built in stages starting in 1891. And, you know, a lot of the folks that owned it, it was like their second home or their party home or their country home. And they also had a house in Denver. So it was sort of sparsely lived in by like the main family that owned it, but they had lots of people who worked on the ranch who were interacting with it. And it was extensively remodeled in 2012 by the Highlands Ranch Metro District. But from 1978, when the town was established, when the community was established, until 2012, it mostly sat empty. It could be used for rentals and things like that. But for the most part, it was empty. I was in it several times during that period. It was creepy. And many, many stories emerged during that period, including from people who lived in the houses nearby, seeing lights and things. And what I'm going to talk about is a couple of stories. So this is the floor plan. The upper one is the lower level of the house. And the lower picture is the upper level of the house. And all the red dots are places where paranormal investigators have found evidence, or where stories have been reported in the newspaper, or people have expressed accounts. The two big stories that I want to talk about are this bedroom in the upstairs, which is at the end of a long hallway. There are windows down this hallway, but really it's just a long hallway ending in a bedroom. And there was a group of nurses who were meeting in the mansion in the late 1970s. You know, it was like a rental venue. And they had their event downstairs, and then you were sort of allowed, because basically they just handed you the keys and you could like wander around the house. And so as it was getting dark, they decided to go explore the house a little bit. So they went down to this bedroom, which is now the I think it's the groom's room. They've poshed it all up and made it really nice. But when they were in there, they said that they saw a basketball-shaped sized mass, a black basketball-shaped orb, and then it responded to yes or no questions by like moving up and down or side to side. There were also stories from people outside the mansion looking at the balcony that's around here, and they said that they saw a little girl throwing flowers over the balcony. And for many years, the rumor was that it was a little girl named Julia, who was the daughter of Frank Kistler, who owned the property in the 1930s, and that Frank and his wife got divorced, and his new wife had boys, and he was always out. He remarried, and his new wife had boys, and so he was always out riding horses with the boys, and poor Julia was left in the house to just pine away waiting for her father. I mean, the problem with that story is Julia Kistler lived to be like an old lady, and didn't die tragically in the house. Somebody asked her sister about it, because she had a younger sister, and her sister was like, okay, that's a total not right story. But it could be, there are theories that ghosts are also like psychic impressions, where people have an intense emotional reaction and leave an impression. So it could have been that. And then down here this has kind of been remodeled now. This used to be an open atrium kind of area, but in the 1970s, when the last owner that lived there, he died right there in that corner, which is now, if you go on a tour of the Highlands Ranch Mansion, that's where you assemble to start your tour, is at where Lawrence Phipps died. So there have been several paranormal investigations that have happened there. They basically do an event almost every Halloween, not this year, sadly. And this was done by a group called Spirit PI, which their website doesn't work anymore, but they have moved on to Facebook. So you should still be able to get a hold of them. And so these are some images that I snagged off their website a few years ago. The clock there, this clock over here, is one of the only permanent features that was like built into the wall. So it's in the living room. So this was all during the period when the building was empty that they did these images. Big orb. I'm not sure how I feel about orbs. I'm going to show you some more later, but they got that. This one with the pineapple wallpaper, this is in the upper area. This was the room where the housekeeper lived. And this investigation was done at night, and over here, there's a window like right here, but there's no reason for this flare to be happening here. So that's what they were showing. Another orb on the floor in the main ballroom downstairs. And then this is kind of a shadowy figure in the upper landing area at the top of the stairs. This one is the most compelling to me. This is the main guy from Spirit PI. And when you blow it up, he's got this weird like smoky thing in front of his hand that he's showing just to kind of differentiate it from the background. They also caught a bunch of audio, which I don't have copies of, but the creepiest thing that they caught was this face on the floor between the, I'll show you where it is. So it's right here between the living room and the billiard room. There's a little step there, and they saw this face. And there are a couple women associated with the history of the mansion who died somewhat tragically. The first was Isabel Springer, who she had two problems: a raging heroin addiction and too many boyfriends. And one of her boyfriends shot the other one at the Brown Palace. And then her husband, John Springer, who owned this house at the time realized that all these shenanigans were going on and divorced her, and she died tragically after the divorce in New York of like a heroin overdose, basically. And then the second one is John Springer's daughter, actually, who was named Annie Hughes, and she inherited the mansion after her dad died, and she killed herself when she was 42 because she thought she had breast cancer. It turned out she did not. She didn't live at the mansion at the time. She was living up in the area around the country club. But you know, it could be one of these two women. I think it's got like an interesting hat happening and a big crooked nose and maybe a fur collar. I don't know. Okay, so then this is the investigation that I actually participated in, the Castle Rock Museum. And it was established, the Castle Rock Museum was originally the railroad depot in Castle Rock. It was built in 1875. It is once again rhyolite. And it was the Denver and Rio Grande depot. And it would have been the transportation hub for Castle Rock, connecting Denver and Colorado Springs to the wider world. There were 9 trains a day through the station, and people would have been in and out of the building all day. Several, you know, shots of where it used to be. So if you have been to downtown Castle Rock recently, this would be in the parking lot behind the fire station is where it is now. So more pictures of the building. And then it sat abandoned after the railroad got rid of it in 1969. And then after a lot of drama, including finding a truck big enough, they moved it. They picked it up and moved the stone building across town. So this is like the middle of downtown Castle Rock in 1969. And they moved it adjacent to I-25 and moved it into place, and it's now the Castle Rock Museum. It was a house for a couple of years, and then in the early 1990s, it became the Castle Rock Museum. So I am part of a group called Modern Day Paranormal Investigators, and we were allowed to set up an investigation there. And the way that we do this is we set up, these are just some shots of the museum. So you get kind of it's a very small building, but you get kind of an overview of what the exhibits look like, and what we were allowed to do. This was the original station agent's uniform. Okay, so what we do is we go in, we set up cameras, audio equipment, and then sort of various paranormal detection devices, and we mark exactly where they are. So like VBJ1 is a audio recorder, and then we like mark where all of them are. We even marked creaky floor here as we were walking around. And the first thing we actually do is interview the people that like work there or live there, and we record that as part of the process. And I'm going to play you an audio clip of, I got to bail out of my PowerPoint for a minute. Oh, sorry, there's my email. You probably don't want to see that. So let's see. So when we did the initial, oh, sorry. We did the initial walkthrough. Actually, I'm going to show you the video first. So this video was taken while the building was closed. So I'll come back to that in just a minute. We'll come back to it. But where this audio that I'm about to play was recorded is where like I'm standing in this shot of this video. Okay, so I've got my speakers turned all the way up. Tamara and I tested this. We're gonna hope that this works to play the audio through my speakers. Okay, so you'll have to turn your audio all the way up and listen closely. So it's over here. And then I will think of that. And so then we're going to repeat it. Okay, so I'm going to go back to the raw All right, so back to the raw audio. This is me standing in this corner. I had just held up a piece of the detection equipment that was supposed to find energy spikes or electrical spikes. And when I had moved it in front of this, this whetstone here, it spiked, like the detector spiked. And so I was explaining that. And then when you listen to this audio again, you might be able to hear an extra voice. So it was over here. And then I went like that. And so I don't know if you can hear it, but when I repeat it, you'll be able to. So to us, that sounded like "kill me," which I was sort of, all the audio that we recorded at the museum had a bit of a sarcastic feel to it. Like, I thought it was like whoever was working that whetstone going, "Oh my God, kill me. I'm so tired of sharpening tools." So that was taken during the interview part of this investigation. And that takes, you know, an hour, 45 minutes. And then we set up all the cameras, lock the building, and leave with the people that had the keys so that we know nobody could like get into the building. And that's when this video happened about 15 minutes after we left. This is a motion detector camera. Because we had had that audio appear, we set it in this corner just in case something happened. And about 15 minutes after we left, this happened. So there is a little audio. It's really hard to hear. So my first question is, why is that camera moving? Because even though we didn't catch a ghost, we caught possibly like something moving the camera. So that's a little weird. And then the other audio that we caught that I thought was the most interesting was this one, right as we were tearing down all the audio equipment. So after we close the building up, we walk around and do if you've ever watched like Ghost Hunters or any of those kind of shows, we do the part where you walk around and go, "Is there anybody here?" And then you like pause and wait to see if they respond, that kind of thing. So this little audio clip was taken upstairs in the office area at the museum. And it's right as they've decided to turn the camera or the audio off. I'm gonna see if I can turn up my volume at all. Let me see. I'm gonna turn this off now. Okay. Okay, so I'm gonna play this again. So this is my friend Terry saying, "I'm gonna turn this off now," and then listen right after that. Just take everything down. I'm gonna turn this off now. So you can kind of hear a little, yeah, okay. Let me play it again. Just take everything down. I'm gonna turn this off now. And that was repeated. I'm gonna actually go back to the kill me audio because I don't think my volume was turned up. Let me play that. So it's over here. And then I went like that. And so those are the two most compelling audio clips that we caught at the museum. And I am going to go back into my PowerPoint and keep going here. So our conclusions about we're good at collecting the data. We're not so great about making conclusions about it. But I mean, basically our conclusion is something is going on. We did have trouble with some of the audio because it's right next to I-25. And there's a seam in I-25. And if you have to listen to 8 audio recorders in a completely silent building with all of the sound turned all the way up, trust me, you can hear every tower or a tire go over I-25. We did catch a distinct child's voice and a male voice. The male voice seemed to be somewhat sarcastic. And then we got various beeps that were happening when the building was empty. So those are like the other audio conclusions that we reached. Okay, so then my final story was out of the newspaper, and it happened, it was published March 9th, 1891. And over the course of several weeks, the telegraph office in Denver said that they received strange messages, and they came collect from an unknown location. So for those of you who were not alive during the telegraph era, telegraph messages are a bit like text messages, except they're in Morse code. So you had to like be able to decipher the code, but essentially they're short little tweet like messages, right? And so they started getting these messages, and they were coming collect like you would get a collect phone call back in the day. And the messages were coming so fast, they were having trouble translating them. And when they finally did find somebody who could like do it fast, read it fast enough, hear it fast enough to translate it, this is what it said. And they were like, okay, that's not making a whole lot of sense. And they texted they telegraphed back to the person who was sending it, the relay station that it was coming from, which was in Kansas City. And they said, I don't get it. So there was a code for I don't get it, which was called 59 or something. And then the message they got back was 131313. And then they started to put together, if you read every other word of this message, it says, I was a man who in my time on earth drank considerable, and one night was killed on what is known as the Continental Ridgeway or Divide. Until this message is deciphered, I will not rest easy in my grave. And then if you read it backwards, it says, I was a man who in my time on earth. So it's the same message going backwards. And they figured that out, and they wrote back ha ha, or the equivalent of ha ha. And then suddenly like this whole flood of messages started to come, and the person sending the messages said, no, really, I was a heavy drinker during the early gold rush era, and I was attacked on the Divide. So this is near Monument. If you drive to Colorado Springs, it's like at the top of the hill. And I was buried really quickly near the road, and now there is a telegraph pole on my chest, is what he was saying. And so because I was a telegraph operator, I am trying to like communicate with people. And he told them exactly how many poles it was from a certain junction box. So they were able to go, they sent 2 guys out there just to like, go on what they felt was a wild goose chase. And when they got out there, they said they saw, they were sitting there having lunch because, they felt like they were on a wild goose chase. And they said they saw a blue light arise out of the ground, come up around the pole, circle around the pole, get into the top. They said tap into the line. I don't know what tap into the line means, but get into the line and then slither back down the pole and back down into the ground. And when they got back to the office, this was the message waiting for them. Your 2 investigators here. They have seen me. Farewell to earth. I have been heard and seen. I am satisfied. Goodbye, H. So that is my final story. So now I can open it up for questions and see what you guys have come up with. So I'm going to stop sharing, Tamar?
Go ahead and do that. And, Shaun, I think like we talked about this earlier, but how did you encounter all these stories? Like what for you is the personal gravitation toward this kind of research? I'll stop there, and then I have a follow-up question.
So I grew up with a lot of ghost stories at my grandma's house in Iowa. And we have the stories of my family bought the house in 1970, and there were stories of a World War II sailor who was killed at the Battle of Guadalcanal, whose family owned the house before us, and that he is like hanging out in the house. And my mom was a teenager when they moved into that house, so there were a lot of, there's some ghost theories that teenagers also cause ghosts to manifest, either through having extra energy and being like, you know, young and energetic. They can draw energies in, or they're more attuned to it. So we had a lot of stories about that. And then I got into like trying to figure out like the real history behind these stories. And so when I was in like high school, I also, I am a giant nerd. So I decided I was going to read all the books in the library in Dewey Decimal order. And the ghosts books are toward the beginning of the Dewey Decimal System. So I read a lot of ghost books when I was in middle school. And then I just sort of, I didn't even know what a folklorist was, but I was sort of collecting ghost stories. Like from the time I've been in 8th grade, I asked people if they have any ghost stories. And so I had ghost stories about where I went to college, and ghost stories about when, where I went to grad school. And so when I moved to Castle Rock, it became natural for me to be like, hey, people that work at this restaurant, it's an old building, do you have any ghost stories? And then I would find things in books and newspaper clippings as well. So that's been a hobby. Okay, somebody was asking for the telegraph again.
A couple folks have asked after the slides, so
okay.
yeah, I think
back.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Let me go back.
Being able to share and whatnot.
Yeah, I just need to do the technology part.
Yeah, and I know you're focused on that, but there you go.
Yeah.
And do you find a satisfying correlation between primary sources that can at least peripherally validate what people claim to see? You know, as you say, folklore plays a really kind of marginal but strong presence in all of this, because that academic discipline can help kind of toe the line between worlds, right?
Right.
So yeah, what do you find the relationship between primary sources and the kind of ghost stories people tell?
I mean, you know, to find the Cheesman Park story, I went straight to the newspapers, which is the primary source for that story. I didn't find any ghost stories in the primary source of the cemetery of the Cheesman Park story. I found secondary stories about that, but then I like to tell like the legit history of a site and then kind of sprinkle in the ghosts to sort of, you know, when I first started doing this, I had to like, I had to convince people that it was like a legit talk to give. And so I had to be like, okay, this is a real history talk that happens to have ghosts in it. So it's almost like the ghosts are like the sugar to make the history go. Sure. And that's always how I've kind of approached it, is like when somebody starts telling me a ghost story, like I looked up one today because I was talking to somebody about this earlier, and I said, well, I stayed at like a really historic hotel, because she was talking about the Stanley. And I said I stayed at a really historic hotel in Cheyenne. It's the Plains Hotel. And I was like, I didn't detect any ghosts, but then I went online like this morning and found, oh yeah, there's ghost stories about the Plains Hotel too. And of course the internet makes it easier to find stories. It also makes it easier for the stories to proliferate that like I would consider to be not like not even legitimate stories. Like a misty woman standing in the foyer of the Old Stone Church is one thing. Like that's kind of an undefined ghost. But like people claiming that, I mean, in Castle Rock, there's a story that like kids were taken off into the woods and something terrible happened to them and there was a big fire, and you know, all of this tragic stuff is happening around the elementary school where the woods were. And you know, you have to put on your skeptic hat and say, okay, so that supposedly happened in the 1890s. There was a local newspaper in the 1890s, and you don't think if a bunch of like sort of foreign immigrant miners took kids from the town into the woods and did something to them, that would not have become national news? I mean, let alone local news. Like the media was the media even back then. They would have blown stuff up. if something had happened. So when you hear something that's like super sensational in a ghost story context, it's probably good to go back and really research what happened. I mean, there have been like major events in Colorado history that have happened tragically to children. There was a school bus tragedy that happened out on the Eastern Plains where the kids got stuck in the snow, and that's basically why we have snow release days now, because they didn't used to send kids home from school when it snowed. But, you know, bus full of kids getting stuck in the snow, not so good.
Right.
So, you know, there are, not to say that there aren't major tragic events that happened, but you just have to look for them, I guess.
Well, and what we've talked about in kind of cultivating this program is just towing that line between when does this really go into supernatural versus when these kind of tragic events just haunt our psyches, right?
Right.
And there is that kind of other power to it. And, you know, and especially this time of year, the veil is thinning. And that's why we're here tonight, folks, you know, to really kind of reacquaint ourselves with that kind of liminal period. And, you know, we just really appreciate you, Shaun, for kind of bringing us, you know, that veil, that thinning of the veil, like into focus, especially with that creepy video and audio. You know I definitely got chills with that. But I'm going to go ahead and we're going to close out this evening, but by no means are these kind of, you know, like I said, the veil is thinning. So we want to thank everyone for joining us this evening. Thank you for the clapping, Nancy. When you log out from this event, there's going to be a survey. Please do take some time to fill it out. This is a new era that we're all in. And even though we're a couple months in, we still very much love to hear what you thought of the program. All this feedback just really keeps us going, keeps us attenuated to what your needs are as an audience. If you really enjoyed this program, you know, just $5, it's kind of a tip of gratitude to Shaun, myself, and others, just really working hard to share our passion and do these things with the people who we'd rather just be in the same room with, quite honestly. But, you know, here we are. So that's going to be in your follow-up emails and whatnot. And then also very fun. And let me kind of, I do want to pull up that. I'll send you this link as well. We've got a bunch of really fun, spooky fun, as I like to say to my kids, Halloween merchandise straight from History Colorado's vault of our collection. So I've got a few tantalizing pieces here to share with you folks. We've got beautiful photographs from our collection for that grassy fields one on the left. We've got some creepy dolls in our collection. So there's something for a pin set, and a bunch of fun postcards that we've blown up to poster size. So I will send those links out in our post-event emails and whatnot. And we just really appreciate you all, especially Shaun. And thank you everyone for all the wonderful comments you have in the chat box there. And hope to see you in future programs as well. And